What is the use of a violent kind of delightfulness if there is no pleasure in not getting tired of it? The question does not come before there is a quotation. If any kind of place there is a top to covering, and it is a pleasure at any rate, there is something venturing in refusing to believe nonsense. It shows what use there is in a whole piece if one uses it, and is extreme, and very likely the little things could be dearer, but in any case, there is a bargain, and if there is a best thing to do, is to take it away and wear it, and then be reckless, and resolved on returning gratitude. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today we are talking about Gertrude Stein. I'm going to talk about tender buttons, specifically objects, in this beautiful illustrated edition from San Francisco-based Chronicle Books. And I'm going to be talking about Four Saints in Three Acts, a libretto she made in collaboration with Virgil Thompson. I also have a CD here of the abridgment that Thompson did and then conducted. So this is actually conducted by the composer, and it's notable for its all black cast. He felt that black voices were most suitable for singing the libretto that Stein wrote. And it's gorgeous, it's playful. You can tell that they really got into the spirit of Stein's fun with words. And the words that she has picked for this thing, they're perfect for the melodies that Thompson chooses. It's really a treat to sit down with the text and put on the music and just read along and enjoy the different cadences and intonation. There's counterpoint at some places because Stein has doubled and in some places triple columned her libretto. So it's going to be a great time today. We're going to read, we're going to look at some art, and we're going to listen to some music. My experience with Stein started in grad school. I had heard of her by that time. Of course, anyone with any acquaintance of Picasso and Matisse, Hemingway, and on down the line will come across Stein's name. She was, of course, a sort of artistic oracle in Paris, but she was a muse and a source of inspiration for more than just artists. Famously, many of the American GIs in post-war France came to see this author of such a complex and intimate and interesting work as Tender Buttons. She studied psychology under William James, who has been noted as saying that she was the brightest pupil he had ever had. She's from German Jewish descent, grew up in America. She was born in Pennsylvania before she expatriated to Paris. While she was here, her first serious work, her first public work, I should say, is Three Lives. William Gass has said in his essay included in A Temple of Texts that when he encountered Three Lives, he read it through the night, literally in a sweat and feverish with inspiration and excitement at what he was experiencing. She almost got her medical degree at Johns Hopkins, and far from just being someone who created a bunch of Mad Lib type nonsense, she was very serious about her craft. Of course, it's closely aligned with experiments that were going on with what became the Cubist movement. She wanted to sort of appropriate what the Cubists were doing for painting and visual art in language, using words not as things to be strung together to give a concrete and clear meaning, but using them the way that the Cubists were using paints. In fact, she spent just as much time publishing and working on her craft as she did talking about it. There are many lectures that we have on her composition. In her big book that came out after Three Lives, The Making of Americans, which is 1,000 pages, she talks about her craft and her method of composition. My experience has been I'll go into Stein's work with gusto, determined to kind of grasp her peculiar flavor, only to be stymied within minutes. And I realize just how strong my urge, my need to make meaning and order out of the world and out of the world of books and literature. And so that drive to make sense of things and to make meaning out of sentences becomes an impasse when you turn your gaze to Gertrude Stein's work. Now, there are more straightforward type offerings. I got thrown off initially because the first thing I read was the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which is really an autobiography of Gertrude Stein told through the mouthpiece of Miss Toklas. But some of her earlier work, such as her portraits on Cézanne and Matisse, are more exemplary of the difficulty I would run into after leaving the relative safety and guardrails of Alice B. Toklas. Here's her portrait on Cézanne. The Irish lady can say that today is every day. Caesar can say that every day is today, and they say that every day is as they say. In this way, we have a place to stay, and he was not met because he was settled to stay. When I said settled, I meant settled to stay. When I said settled to stay, I meant settled to stay Saturday. In this way, a mouth is a mouth. In this way, if in as a mouth, if in as a mouth were, if in as a mouth were and there, where and there, believe they have water too. I'll stop there. But you see what I mean about the difficulty. Connecting with Gertrude Stein's work for me is a very slippery thing. It slides around my brain. And just when I feel like I'm starting to understand her craft and her project, it eludes my grasp. It's much like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree. And I think to myself, it seems absurd to read sentence after sentence, and they just sort of run through me as water through a sieve, only to find that one sentence here and there that does pop out at me and does grab something of my attention. And if it's doing that for me, then of course it's doing that for others. And most likely it's different sentences that are popping out at different readers. And so you want to seize on that sentence and you want to try and wring out meaning, or at least get to the psychology of why it stood out for you. Is it the visual combination of those words on the page? Is it the sound of them? Many people, including Stein scholars, have talked about how it's the pleasing sounds that we hear when we read her out loud, which makes her libretto written for voices so interesting to us. And the fact that they've been scored and set into a composition, an operatic sensation by Virgil Thomson, is key, I think, to unlocking more of the pleasure to be had in engaging with Stein. The type of reader I am, when I see other people having a great time with some book or some author and singing their praises, and I didn't really see it that way. Like, I didn't think that the stuff was very good or that the author is very important. I'm not the type where my initial reaction is, what's wrong with them? Like, you guys are crazy. My initial reaction is, what's wrong with me? I want to have that experience. I guess I have a sort of literary FOMO, which I'm told means fear of missing out. And that leads me to try my best as a reader to open myself up to all kinds of different writers and grasp something of their flavor and position in this history of literary conversation. And so one day I was talking with a friend of mine about how troubled I am that I've had such difficulty with Stein over the years. I've read Tender Buttons several times. In fact, I made a video just on Tender Buttons a year or so ago, and I ended up deleting it because I didn't think that it really had anything of worth for others. It was very negative, and it was more a sort of psychology session where I laid on a couch and lamented about my ineptitude as a reader when it came to Stein. And so I got rid of it and decided I'd revisit it. My friend told me, hey, have you listened to the Virgil Thomson of Gertrude Stein? And I said, no. And my friend said, why don't you try to find that, listen to it, and just enjoy it? And sure enough, I sat down with it and I found myself laughing and smiling and singing along once I started to catch on with different things. And it started to give me that appreciation for the beauty of the sound of what Stein had rendered in text. And so I'm going to play a clip from that performance. But first I'll read the way that I read it in my mind, the section that we'll then hear from Virgil Thompson. Saint Teresa in a storm at Avila. There can be rain and warm snow, and warm that is the water is warm, the river is not warm, the sun is not warm, and if to stay to cry. If to stay, to if to stay, if having to stay, to if having to stay, if to cry to stay, if to cry, stay to cry to stay. Saint Teresa half in and half out of doors. Saint Ignatius not there. Saint Ignatius staying where? Never heard them speak of it. Saint Ignatius, silent motive not hidden. Saint Teresa, silent. They were never beset. Come one. No saint to remember, no saint to remember. Saint Teresa knowing young and told. If it were possible to kill 5,000 Chinamen by pressing a button, would it be done? Saint Teresa not interested. And then we get a cue. Repeat first act. A pleasure, April Fool's Day, a pleasure, Saint Teresa seated. Now, in true Stein fashion, it says repeat first act, and then goes on to that, a pleasure, April Fool's Day, a pleasure. That is not first act. Furthermore, if you keep hitting the cue to repeat first act, wouldn't you just get stuck in a loop repeating the first act? She knows all this. Even the very title, 4 Saints and 3 Acts. There are more than 4 saints and there are more than 3 acts. Stuff's repeated. Act 4, Scene 5 happens over and over. Now let's listen to that as composed and conducted by Virgil Thompson.
Saint Teresa in a storm at Avila, there can be rain and warm, snow and warm. That is, the water is warm, the river is not warm, the sun is not warm. And if to stay to cry, if to stay to, if to stay, if having to stay to, if having to stay, if to cry to stay, if to cry stay, to cry to stay. Saint Teresa happy and hard out of doors. Saint Ignatius not there, Saint Ignatius staying where? Never heard them speak of it. Saint Ignatius silent, motive not hidden. Saint Teresa silent, they would never be set. Come one. No saint to remember. No saint to remember. Saint Teresa knowing, young and tall. If it were possible to kill 5,000 Chinamen by pressing a button, would it be done? Saint Teresa not interested.
Repeat first act.
A pleasure, April Fool's Day, a pleasure. Saint Teresa seated.
Like I said though, Stein is not just trying to present nonsense or gibberish. In fact, she was emphatic about the fact of how simple everything she wrote was. And she wasn't alone. Sherwood Anderson backed her. Even Richard Wright let some of his black friends listen to him read The Second Life from 3 Lives out loud, and they loved it and connected with it and it made perfect sense. People have been quoted with saying, far from being difficult and complex, a 6-year-old schoolgirl could make sense of Stein's sentences. Hyperbole? Perhaps. But I've said before, and I still believe, that children are better equipped with connecting with art and grasping subtle, unspoken and unwritten meanings than adults. So part of the frustration that I think I have felt with Stein stems from my adult mind. It's so cluttered and so primed for engaging critically with a text instead of just enjoying it as a child would a book. Tender Buttons from 1914 is, like I said, a more complex, more difficult, more intimate work. But in this Chronicle Books edition with these beautiful illustrations from Lisa Congdon, now that I've read it about 5 times, certain things are starting to jump out at me. Certain sentences are becoming beautiful and lodged in my mind. Certainly glittering is handsome and convincing. The amusing side is that the sooner there are no fewer, the more certain is the necessity dwindled. Water, astonishing and difficult, altogether makes a meadow and a stroke. There are two moments in Tender Buttons in particular that jumped out at me even the very first time I read it, because I was familiar with the Japanese concept of kintsugi. Kintsugi is repairing a broken vessel, like a piece of pottery, by using a sort of powdery gold mixture that highlights the cracks, that highlights the brokenness, and thus highlights the history of that object and the history of its brokenness and its healing. And many people believe it is more beautiful because of its once brokenness. I believe that Stein was hinting at Kintsugi in Tender Buttons when she says, "No cup is broken in more places than mended." That is to say, a plate is broken and mending does do that. It shows that culture is Japanese, which is echoed and affirmed by a brief sentence that says, "There can be breakages in Japanese." In Edmund Wilson's book, Axel's Castle, which is a study of imaginative literature from 1870 to 1930, and it contains Proust, it contains Joyce, and it has a chapter dedicated to Gertrude Stein. Of the Making of the Americans, he says, "I confess that I have not read this book all through, and I do not know whether it is possible to do so." Many people had this same sentiment, whereas others, as you can imagine, thought it was amazing. I myself am like Wilson. I couldn't get through it and had to put it down. And I talked about this a little bit in my Macintosh video because Miss Macintosh employs a Gertrude Stein-like repetition, or what I called recurrence, in my video on Miss Macintosh. Stein, for her repetition, which is much closer in proximity and uses smaller units of material, let's call it, she referred to it as insistence. She also, at one point, made a discovery that paragraphs have emotion, but sentences don't. At the time of Tender Buttons, Edmund Wilson tells us, Gertrude Stein is said to have made a practice of shutting herself up at night and trying utterly to banish from her mind all the words ordinarily associated with the ideas she had fixed upon. She had come to believe that words had other values than those inherent in their actual meanings, and she was attempting to produce a kind of literature which should work with these values exclusively. And that right there is specifically the point or the project in Stein's work that slides around and eludes my mind. I get that she is utilizing words for a property other than their apparent meaning. She wants to use them again the way that the Cubists and visual artists use lines and color. They're trying to evoke something that isn't just a clear definition of what's being pictured. She's trying to banish meaning. And so when you're reading her sentences, when you're reading her words, the meanings of those words and what we would normally grasp as the signified is gone. In fact, this is what led Kenneth Burke to refer to Stein as a practitioner of the art of subtraction. Included in this Gertrude Stein reader, which has been my access point for many, many years. It's from Vintage. They include the lecture that she gave at Cambridge and Oxford called Composition as Explanation. And in here, she talks about how she utilizes three things. She creates a continuous present, and then she begins again and again. And she uses everything. What does that mean? I'm not quite sure. I think I know, but I can only see it in part, as if through a glass darkly. Still, the point remains, as succinctly and articulately put here in the introduction called A Stein Song by her good friend Carl van Vechten. If Picasso is applauded for painting pictures which do not represent anything he has hitherto seen, if Schoenberg can pen a score that sounds entirely new even to ears accustomed to listening to modern music, why should an employer of English words be required to form sentences which are familiar in meaning, shape, and sound to any casual reader? And I think the rub here is that it takes longer to read, say, The Making of Americans than it does to listen to a symphony or a piece of chamber music. It demands more time and more sustained focus to read a book than it does to look at a painting for a little while. Still, when it comes down to it, as Stein herself said, my little sentences have gotten under their skins.